And literally he should have died. And but as he shows here in this quote after his brain train, the great thing is we had a baseline map on him. We understood his brain. Levi was on high doses already of omega-3s for resilience, and literally within not much time at all for that serious of a traumatic brain injury, which is about as serious as it gets, 360 feet going straight into concrete with your head. Was able to get back, and as he even states here, a better focus than he even had before. And that's definitely due to the resilience he had built up ahead of time, and to the high doses and stuff going afterwards. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that towards the end of here, is what to do when you have a major injury. We've worked for a long time with the Department of Defense and work with the Army on really kind of bringing these guys up to, through a program called Comprehensive Soldier Fitness that Dr. Johnson's been a part of in the past. And he's really led a lot of the development with that, but really introducing the omega-3s as a resilience piece, but also for, the overall health and prevention of disease and stuff in the soldier as well. So those are just a few things. The first thing here that we're really going to dive into is that you need to understand first and foremost that the brain is all about electricity. Every feeling you have, thought you have, when you move your finger, all of that is because the brain's producing certain frequencies or certain electricity in certain areas of the brain. So it communicates completely, and the way it communicates is obviously, as you guys all know, this nervous system. And if that wiring breaks or that wiring has interference, then those signals have interference, and you will have loss or diminished function when that happens. So just start with that. The next thing that we're going to talk about is that each part of the brain does a different predominant function. So as we talk about the frontal portion of the brain here, and which is really involved in more your higher mental functions, your concentration, planning, judgment, creativity, all those different things as you're planning and organizing and focusing. If you do not produce enough electricity in that part of the brain, you won't function properly. So a kid with, say, ADHD is not producing enough electricity in the prefrontal portion of the brain. Now, there's other forms of ADD that can be different areas of the brain and different problems, but basically, slow wave disorder, ADD, that is typically responds to stimulant medication is due to the prefrontal portion of the brain not producing enough electricity. At the same time, if that prefrontal portion of the brain produces too much electricity, it can overfunction. It's almost like having a spasm in the muscle, and that can cause things like OCD and obsessive and compulsive type disorders, and even things like perfectionism and not being able to let go of things and just looping in the mind. All that can be caused by overactive neurons. So you can see we don't want overactive, we don't want underactive, we want it to be somewhere right in the middle, and that's when you optimize those neural pathways, those neurons, and those connections, you tend to get this optimal amount of electricity that can supply the electricity when it's needed, and then it regulates back down when it's not needed. It doesn't stay stuck. Every area of the brain has to have all these electrical impulses connecting it in order for it to function on the different areas. So let's dive into, the concussion side. And the concussion, as Dan said, is a mild traumatic brain injury. Obviously, it can be a full traumatic brain injury. Someone like Levi LaValle that jumped had a full TBI. But most concussion that we talk about in sport is going to be mild TBI. And again, traumatic brain injury or mild TBI and concussion is when the brain hits inside the skull. So even with a helmet on, it does not matter. The brain still slams against the inside of the skull, and that's what causes the problem. And it causes a lot of times what's called a contra-Q injury, where the brain actually ricochets and bounces back and forth, almost like a whiplash inside the brain. So even if you don't physically hit a structure, it's that flexion extension, hyperflexion, hyperextension injury that actually hurts and damages the outside of the brain, that cortex where all the gray matter is and all those neurons are, okay? So, and Dan's going to talk a little bit about this in a little bit, later on in this presentation too. But the tissue insult is really just the beginning of concussion. So once that hit happens, that's when really the damage starts to spread. And if it's not controlled right away, it gets worse and worse and worse. And this can happen anywhere from, at first seconds up to minutes, and then it gets to hours, can even get worse and worse. And you can actually have cell death and all kinds of things that start occurring days, weeks, and months later. That's why you continue to have a post-concussion effect even up to months later. And that's where it's even more difficult to try and regenerate that. Resilience is the key to this that we're going to talk about. So again, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to jump in there and make one comment. And it's a really important point to understand how all this is really kind of the secondary phase after the event that, as Brian said, and as this graph shows here on the left, can take place for hours and days and weeks later. That is this ongoing sort of cellular disruption, ischemia, inflammation, there is a tremendous amount of just metabolic disruption in the cells. And the key thing is that you cannot really measure this. I mean, our traditional way of looking at head injury, a CT scan, is really just they're measuring blood, like any massive bleeding from the acute injury. But it's all this secondary phase that disrupts function and really can lead to long-term problems functionally for the individual. That is, not only is there not a way to really accurately measure it, but they're really not focusing on preventing it or treating it, even with micro head injury. So again, it's this secondary phase, all this cellular disruption that we don't have a routine way in the medical field to analyze it, and we're really not doing anything aggressively to manage it. So it's important for really important point. Thank you, Brian.
Perfect. And the important thing here is the healthier the neurons ahead of time, the less disruptive damage is going to happen. The more deficient you are in specific fatty acids, the more inflammation that's going to happen, the more levels of damage is going to happen, the less BDNF is going to be released to repair these neurons. So it's so much about the level of brain health prior to the concussion that really adds to a tremendous amount of resilience. Trying to repair this afterwards when you have deficiencies going into it is definitely possible, and we're going to talk about that, but it's still a long shot compared to if you can build up a resilience ahead of time for these. So that's why we really believe that within 5 years' time that you will not be able to play a high school sport or a college sport without having a high enough percentage in your omega-3 index, because there's so many studies that show the resilience factor of this. So, all right, so one of those things, as we talked about, you can see so many things can happen, but just one thing we're just going to kind of talk about here is that, again, normal cell function, normal neuronal impulses going through this nervous system and through the brain, and it's how the brain communicates. The problem is that a lot of times when you have a concussion, you can have shearing of the actual neurons and the axons, which happen like this. But you can also, even if it doesn't completely shear, you can have just a dysregulation of that and a decrease in the amount of electricity in the flow and the regulation of that electricity. If there is shearing that absolutely happens, if those connections don't grow back very quickly, you will actually have this part of the cell actually start to die off, and you can actually start to lose a lot of these neurons and can cause a lot of permanent damage and take a lot longer to regenerate if they can fully regenerate. So that's why it's so important, again, the resilience side of it is because if you can quickly get to this before the weeks and months after, and you can get those connections back, you can start to regenerate some of this. But the whole goal is to have enough neurons and enough connections ahead of time that even if there's some shearing that happens or some dysregulation, you have enough that it still is communicating well. Now, the way we can detect a lot of this is quantitative EEG. It measures the electrical impulses that are coming off the brain, and it separates them down by frequency, which is really has to do with the function. So when we talk about QEEG, what we're showing here is amplitude asymmetry. I want to talk a little bit first about these frequencies. So instead of looking at all the frequencies together, we're just filtering it down here to 1 to 4 hertz and only looking at 1 to 4 hertz in this map. We're looking at 4 to 8 hertz in this map, and then 8 to 12 hertz. Each of those ranges, 1 to 4, do a different function. Okay, 1 to 4 hertz mainly handles the autonomic nervous functions, the sleep regulation, the circadian rhythm at night, the digestion, circulation, immune function, all those type of subconscious type behaviors. The brain is keeping you alive, regulating the body, doing everything in those 1 to 4 hertz. Then as you move up to 4 to 8 hertz, that's where it's more, you know, basically think of that as kind of where subconscious and conscious start to come together. Again, this delta is subconscious. This alpha we're going to talk about right in just a minute is going to be when the brain is fully awake. So this theta is that in-between state where you think about it, you know, daydreaming, getting fatigued. Additionally, the limbic system in the center of the brain, the emotions and mood have a lot to do with, they produce a lot of the theta waves in the brain. So that's why when after a concussion, if your theta waves or if your limbic system is jarred and not communicating correctly, you'll have a disruption in these theta waves, which will cause mood instability, it'll cause emotional instability. If you've ever seen someone after a concussion, they can be very emotional about things. And that has to do with the limbic system, and we can see that in this theta. And as we get to the alpha, the brain is now fully awake. This is fully awake, but it's very much like a car in neutral. It's not going anywhere. It's not engaged in an activity. It's very present. It's great for things like meditation. It's great for things like sleep initiation before you go to sleep. That's how you can still your mind. But it's also a great state for letting go of things. So think about a golfer that just pushed the last 1-foot putt. As he comes into the next hole, if he can increase his alpha waves, he can actually go into a state of very presence on the hole he's on, not thinking about what happened in the past, not thinking about what will happen in the future. It's really, in sports, we train a lot of people to achieve this alpha state, to be very present in what they're doing. And then as we go up further, we got beta, which is going to be more your motivation, goal-directed, engaged, problem-solving. This is what we kind of live in each day in work and school. And as we get up to the high beta, 25 plus, we're really talking more about the stress management, fear, fight or flight area. So this actually shows neuronal disruption in each of those frequency bands, which means we can actually predict the symptoms. We can have someone come in, do a map, and actually tell them what their symptoms are based on their EEG, because we know the disruption in those different frequency bands. The blue lines are showing us areas that are basically it's hypo with symmetry. So it's basically not connected correctly. It's not communicating correctly. So it's hyposymmetry. So we can see those areas that are not communicating correctly, and then we can see the red lines, which are hyper-connected. So those are areas that are too synchronized together, and those are taking the load of the brain. So the blue, it's not efficiently communicating, and it has a lot to do, again, with neuronal damage that happens. The axons could be tearing. It's not getting enough electricity from point A to point B, and the red is taking on that load. So that becomes, now it will create a lot of hypersensitivity to things like light, hypersensitivity to sound. Again, in the limbic system, the theta waves, it could be hypersensitivity to more emotional or mood problems. In the alpha range, it could be more difficulty going to sleep or getting the right sleep patterns. And so each of these things, we can actually see that those neurons are not communicating correctly, or that there's too much load on them, and that will cause functional problems. So what we're going to talk about is really how we can take from the science of EEG and measuring all this stuff, and how we can measure that with the brain span assessment, but really have more of something we can do with it, an intervention that we can actually change some of this. And in a lot of ways, our goal is to prevent a lot of this from happening. So the things we're going to talk about is really 3 things. Think about this in terms of neuroprotection. What can we do to increase the connections between the neurons ahead of time? That's so key. We have to increase those neurons ahead of time, those connections, those synapses ahead of time, so that if there's a problem, you have strong, strong connections. And even if some rip, some tear, some shear, some disconnect, you have so many connections already that you barely notice the problem. Also, we're going to talk about increasing cell membrane fluidity and how important that is to the nutritional health of the cell, and to be able to combat a lot of the things that we were talking about earlier, that Dan talked about with some of the problems that can happen, months even later. We're going to talk about neuroinflammation and how we can regulate that and prepare the cell to have the proper inflammatory response. What happens a lot of times is we have so much pro-inflammatory fatty acids that it's an oversensitive trigger. It starts launching inflammation at small little things, and it has too much of an attack on that, which causes a lot of problems with that inflammatory response. We want to keep that in check to a proper inflammatory response. And then we're going to talk about neuroregeneration, how we can regrow and repair some of these neurons. So to start with, the neuroprotection portion is, again, we have to increase the connections between the neurons, and that requires omega-3s. Omega-3s are a precursor to the production of BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which supports the survival of existing neurons and encourages the growth of new neurons and synapses. So that is so important. You can see here a picture of actual deficient omega-3 index. There's very few dendrites there, very few axons. They're connecting to each other, and you can see this the optimal omega-3 index right there, a high omega-3 over 8%. That you can see the difference there and how many connections there are. So the one on the left is going to be much more resilient towards injury than the one on the right.
And Brian, if I could just make one point, it's a great slide, and I think that it has a lot of other applications as it relates kind of to a different topic. But when we talk about cognitive decline and dementia, and when we see the loss of these over time with the aging process, or in some type of neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's, where that's why one of the big reasons why we promote this test and rely on the science that taking this and maintaining a high omega-3 index, we know prevents 47% reduction in dementia over 10 years, is because of this mechanism of the BDNF, but also the DHA itself is a building block itself in the cell wall. So it's the BDNF and it's the DHA. So this is the same mechanism, just to remind our providers, the same mechanism of why this is so critical for long-term prevention of cognitive decline and dementia.
Excellent point, Dan. Excellent point. Yeah, definitely. Think of the DHA as the bricks of a building. And really, the DHA, just like bricks are to a building, DHA is to the structure of the brain. And you take away that DHA, you start to crumble, you start to get less and less structure, and eventually that will collapse. And we want to age with the brain on the left. That's a much more resilient towards aging. BrainSpan assessment actually measures the biomarkers, the most correlated biomarkers that are associated with neural growth and neuroprotection, which is the omega-3 index. And again, we use the exact same methodology. Bill Harris, one of the founders, the co-founder with Dan and I, is the grandfather, I would say, of the omega-3 index. He put all this together in the early days. He's done over 200 peer-reviewed research articles on this, research papers and studies, and literally has put this together. So this has been around for a long time. It's been definitely through the science, the literature, it's all over. It's the exact same methodology. And what's great is once you measure it, even when you see a deficiency, you can see down here, inefficient, so many people are around 3% even, very into the deficient side. And we give you, based on peer-reviewed studies, we give you right here, the actual dose that you need to get up to 8% within 3 months. So for this person, if they take 2,500 milligrams of EPA DHA per day for 3 months, we are projecting, based on a lot of research and a lot of peer-reviewed studies, that they will hit 8% in 3 months. And then you can test again, make sure you're there. There are genetic metabolic factors that can impede that a little bit, but most of the time, I'd say probably 85 to 90% of the time, people will be able to achieve that level by taking the dose that we recommend. And again, this dose is very specific to each person. So we measure it, measure the deficiency, and then we give you the specific dose you need to take to be able to get to the level of resilience. The next thing is neuroprotection. Think of this as increased cell membrane fluidity. So again, a healthy cell is more resilient to injury and recovers faster. This is really important. On the left, this is a cell membrane that has a lot of fluidity, okay, with high omega-3s and DHA. You can see these little, things are coming down there, kind of pushing off to the left. They actually are producing more room through the membrane for proteins and neurotransmitters and different things to actually exchange, go in and out. Cell membranes are like gateways that allow these nutrients to come in and to nourish the cells, but it also allows the proteins like BDNF, the neurotransmitters to go out and exchange through the cell. So it makes a lot of these little gateways, it makes it very easy for the right nutrients to get in, and then it makes it easy for the neurotransmitters to get out. One kind of side point, I heard someone talk the other day, and I thought it was so good. What they said is the foundation for nutritional health is the omega-3s. Because if you don't address these cell membranes ahead of time, all the other nutrients you're taking and nutrition, whether you're getting it from food, whether you're getting it from supplements, it doesn't matter, is not getting, or it's inhibiting it getting through the cell wall. So the cell is not getting as nourished, and it's stopping, because you can see this rigid membrane on the other side, on the right side, from palmitic acid, trans fats, saturated fats, that specific saturated fats, palmitic acid mainly, that stops a lot of the nutrients from getting into the cell. So if you're taking a lot of vitamins or eating, this Mediterranean diet or extremely healthy, and you don't have enough omega-3s in your cell membrane, your cells are not absorbing enough of those nutrients. So address that first and everything else secondary. So again, this shows what we want is a healthy cell. And you saw the slide that showed all those things that happen and how the cell starts breaking down, inflammation hits it, it dysregulates the neurotransmitters, all those things start happening. And if the cell is not healthy, or it's very rigid in the membrane, it will break down so much faster and dysregulate, versus a healthy cell is going to add to a lot of resiliency. So it's very important from the cell membrane structure to be resilient and be able to be flexible, basically, when the injury occurs. And a fluid membrane actually will not shear near as much as a rigid membrane. So that's important to know as well. You want that flexibility or fluidity in the cell membrane.
Yeah, that's a good point, Brian. Just if I could just reiterate that it's thought to be sort of multiple mechanisms of how both the EPA and DHA really work in a injured brain to help, number one, resilience against all that secondary injury that we talked about, as well as even resilience against the primary injury. And as Brian said, there's theories that it's both a structural, mechanical a benefit that the higher omega-3 unsaturated fatty acids provide to the membrane, as well as all that decrease in inflammation. But we know, obviously, most of the studies on this have been animal models. And we know that when we boost up the animal's DHA prior to the injury in the lab testing, that the shearing of the axons, when we actually look at that, it's dramatically reduced when we supplement them with DHA. So you're exactly right, Brian. Just wanted to reiterate that. Thanks.
Perfect. And again, the biggest things that make the cell membrane rigid is a buildup of palmitic acid or trans fat. Not all saturated fats add to the rigidity of the membrane. It's mainly palmitic acid and trans fat. They also start to block some of the omega-3s. The trans fats actually can get in there and actually block the production or block the attachment of some of the omega-3s in there. So you want to keep down the level of palmitic acid and the trans fat in order to allow it. You want to increase omega-3s and eliminate a lot of the palmitic acid or the excessive amounts of palmitic acid and all of the trans fat. And again, the brain span assessment measures those key biomarkers associated with cell membrane fluidity. Again, we already talked about the omega-3 index. You want to increase your omega-3s, but if you don't address the palmitic acid levels and the trans fat levels, it's not going to matter as much. You're not going to be as efficient as at creating that cell fluidity. So again, the brain span assessment measures where you should be on the palmitic acid levels, getting to that optimal level. Again, you want some palmitic acid in your blood cells. That helps, coat the lungs. It helps a lot of different things, but you don't want it to be excessive. And excessive levels of palmitic acid is really when carbohydrates convert to this saturated fat. It converts to palmitic acid. So if you have excess carbohydrates where the body cannot burn it off, mainly through simple carbs, it will convert to palmitic acid. So that's how you increase your palmitic acid. It all comes back down to sugar and simple carbs that you're not burning off, and it's converting. Trans fat, I think most people understand trans fat. The next thing, so we talked about kind of this balance, we talked about the neuroprotection side, the cell membrane fluidity, how important that is, the amount of connections that are important. The next thing we're going to really talk about is this neuroinflammation and the regulation of cell inflammation. Omega-3s help combat the pro-inflammatory response of omega-6s. What you want for optimal cell function is going to be about a 1-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6. Again, omega-6s are essential fatty acids. We need them. You want to have an inflammatory response when it's needed, but you want to have that in check. And our bodies are meant, they were built to actually have a 1-to-1 ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s, and we will have the perfectly optimized inflammatory response. Typical in the US is somewhere around 20-to-1. We have people all the time that are 40 or 50. I saw a kid the other day at one of our brain centers that was a 53-to-1. 53-to-1 omega-6s to omega-3s. Again, omega-3s that we're talking about are the EPA and DHA. Very, very important. These are marine omega-3s. The ALA that we get from plants like flax and some of the other plants we get omega-3s, those are great for the heart, great for energy, but they do very, very little for the brain. They do not convert. A very small percentage converts over to the DHA and EPA. So what we want is the marine-based fish oils or eating fish to get your omega-3s, and then we weigh that against your omega-6s. And you can see in this ratio how it can be so far off, and it causes so many of the problems. The biggest problem is that 20% of all processed foods is basically soy or corn or vegetable oils. And it's not that those foods are so bad by themselves, it's the fact that it's so inundated in every food we have. It's the main source of protein we're getting, so it's just this huge amounts of omega-6s. Very, very little. We're very deficient in eating fish and good omega-3s, and that's what's causing the problem. Now, typically in Japan, it's, I think, about a 3-to-1 ratio. In some of the Mediterranean areas, it's a 4 or 5-to-1 ratio. So the US and some of the European countries are the worst. Now, this inflammation problem, we're addressing it from the brain, obviously, because the more inflammatory response, when there is an injury, the more the brain overreacts to it, and the more it causes damage to a lot of those neural pathways and stuff, especially if it lasts for too long. But really, that same inflammatory response is the underpinning condition of many of the, or the underpinning problem and cause of many of the problems you guys already treat. And all the way from, obviously, nervous system dysfunction, arthritis, diabetes, chronic pain, headaches, migraines, cancer, chronic disease, poor memory, attention problems, ADHD, Alzheimer's disease, to depression, anxiety. all of those usually have some corresponding aspect to inflammation. And really addressing that omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, those cells are not just in the brain. Those cells are throughout the entire body. And we can minimize and optimize this inflammatory response, or I would say optimize the inflammatory response by addressing this, and we can measure it. And once people see it, that's when they want to make a change. If you don't measure it, people will not change this. So it's so important. But to address it through the brain, one thing that Dan said the other day I thought was so good is that, when we look at our bodies, even though this is hurting our heart, we're talking about increasing cancer rates and chronic disease, that's still way off in the future. And people make very little changes about what's going to happen in the future. Well, with the brain, with ADHD, poor sleep, poor focus, memory slipping, all those things, those are today, and people can feel them so much faster. So to put an emphasis on the brain, but know it's helping all these other things is great. People will make more changes and change faster for brain health than most of these other things, except for maybe headaches and migraine or chronic pain. Those are two that they definitely feel right away. And again, we are measuring the key biomarkers associated with cell inflammation. Those key biomarkers are the AA, which is the most pro-inflammatory omega-6. EPA is the most anti-inflammatory omega-3. We measure that in the brain span assessment, and we can tell exactly where you are, and then we give specific recommendations of how to change that and how to address it. So in summary, think of three things here. What we need to increase. We increase our neuroprotection, we increase our omega-3s, and again, it's not about just taking omega-3s. 80% of omega-3s on the market today are highly oxidized and are not actually changing this omega-3 index or changing the cell health. Okay, if they're highly oxidized, they don't do anything for you. Okay, a lot of them are rancid, they're just adding to free radicals, but they're free oxidative stress in your cells in your blood. So what we want to do is we want to measure it and see where they are, and then after you're on an intervention or on whichever omega-3 you're using or eating more fish, then we want to measure it again and make sure it worked, make sure it's changing the blood based on your metabolism, based on your genetic factors, based on all these things. Even BMI and all kinds of things can change the way your blood cells will actually assimilate these omega-3s in the actual membrane itself. So we have to measure. You measure it and you increase it, and then you measure it again to make sure it's increased. We have to balance inflammation, balance that omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. You can do a lot of that by increasing the omega-3s, but by bringing down some of the things, there's some simple things you can do to bring down the omega-6 levels that we eat. So balance inflammation, and then eliminate the neurotoxins. So eliminate the palmitic acid, eliminate the trans fat. Again, these are silent killers. People don't even know they're there. You've got to measure these in order to make a difference and to see where they are. If you increase the omega-3s, balance the omega-3 omega-6 ratio, and eliminate the neurotoxins, the palmitic acid and the trans fat, you will have an optimal, healthy brain cell that can be more resilient to concussion. And, again, we're just talking about the brain, but really the entire body changes for health. So I'm going to talk real quick about a couple case studies that we've done with Oaks Christian Brain Performance Center. The Oaks Christian High School is in Southern California. It's one of the most predominant exclusive private schools in probably all of Southern California. And so with that, we have a large, one of the very first brain performance centers that is on campus for students to be able to use and come and have access to this. So we're very involved with all the athletics, with the school, with the athletes. This brain performance center, the school put, probably about $500,000 into. It will rival any brain performance center on, Stanford, UCSF. I've been at them all. I was just at University of Texas, Dallas the other day at their Brain Performance Institute. So this is literally probably the best in the country, or at least, equal to the best in the country. And so again, we use all kinds of different things, from neurofeedback to quantitative EEG to a lot of other biofeedback, different types of biofeedback. But one of the things that we are using the majority with almost all the students now is the brain span assessment. And even starting next year, every single athlete will be tested with the brain span assessment to make sure that they're resilient enough to play impact sports. And so this is a couple of case studies, again, that we did with a high school football player that got a concussion this last year, got a concussion on 9/16, and the EEG was recorded 2 weeks later, and we also recorded the blood work 2 weeks later. So again, this is the EEG ahead of time. You can see all the amplitude asymmetry, and the areas, again, in blue are the areas that are disconnected or not communicating properly. The areas in red are hyperconnected and overloading those brain's networks. It's actually producing too much electricity between those areas, which are overriding, putting too much pressure and strain on those neurons, which will cause all kinds of functional problems. But you can see when we did the brain span test where this person's omega-3s were, down at 3.7, very, very low, so probably had less connections, less neurons, actually less density in the brain. So when you damage those neurons, more percentage of the available neurons are going to be damaged and cause problems. Inflammation index, you can see are 33 to 1. 33 to 1. We want 1 to 1. So that's going to cause now this cascading inflammation response to this tissue insult. And palmitic acid, again, kind of moderate, not where it needs to be, but not horrible. And trans fat, again, kind of moderate as well. So kind of moderate on the toxin side, horrible on the inflammation side, which is just going to lead to more and more problems. This person did have problems way beyond those 2 weeks. They continued. We had to use a lot of neurofeedback actually to repair a lot of this because they didn't have enough resilience. Now, the same position, the same type of position, the same structural injury, again, with these things, these are just case studies. You can't control for perfect everything for the same exact injury in humans. We can do that with rats and things where we put them in a little contraption that knocks them over the head, but they won't allow us to do that on humans, so it's probably good. But this is someone that came in, again, just about a month later on 10/14, had a concussion. This knocked him out. This completely knocked him out, taken off the field. 2 weeks later, had not returned to play yet. Symptoms were gone, but since they did knock him out and did have some, it was a pretty major thing, they wanted to be just totally sure that it was healed. So we did a brain map. You can see amplitude asymmetry looks perfect. Not one line across the whole thing. And when we did the blood spot test on him, look at these scores. This is someone that already had a previous blood spot test too. And so obviously they had taken for almost a year high doses of omega-3s, good doses. And you can see 11.1%. This is someone who had so many connections and so much neural protection against that even in a massive concussion had no lasting effects from that, and no shearing, no dysregulation, no overloading of the other networks. The brain was working perfect, and he didn't have any symptoms at this time either, even 2 weeks later. Palmitic acid was in the good levels, trans fat was in the good levels. This is someone that really had been taking care of himself, and he's one of the star athletes. He's actually going off to Stanford, full ride scholarship this year to play football.
Yeah, and Brian, just a quick word on that AA, the inflammation index, the AA to EPA ratio. As you can see, this guy's 3 to 1, which is great. And as Brian said, the goal is to get that, below, I'd say below 2. If you look at across populations, the average American's about 16 to 1. For just general cardioprotective benefits, we want to get to 4 to 1. And if you were to look at, if somebody who's a serious athlete, you want, basically get them to the same level we see in the Japanese population, which is about a 1.7 to 1. So if you're below 2, you're doing fantastic from an overall cognitive as well as cardiovascular and sort of total body health.
Yeah, what do you think about this one, Dion, with the 33 to 1?
Yeah, well, typical high school kid, right? Eating hot dogs and corn dogs and hamburgers and probably some French fries on the side, you know.
Well, and how about the military? On all the ones you did, you probably saw a lot of that too.
Yeah, that's right, and it's exactly right. When you do have an injury, and this doesn't have to just be head injury. I know that's the focus of our talk, but any kind of injury where there's you just have a firestorm ready to start of inflammation, and obviously when it comes to the brain, that just causes a lot of long-term sequelae that we want to avoid. So yeah, it's a great point.
Perfect. So we have all kinds of research on this, different studies. Again, majority of the ones with, that are more controlled are definitely in the, using animal studies. It's the only way you can really control this. But there's a lot of other studies that have shown, population studies and stuff that show that the omega-3s are super important in controlling the problems with oxidative stress, inflammation, axonal tearing, all these things. Harvard actually did a study, it's on our website, that shows there's 96,000 deaths per year, preventable deaths per year due to low omega-3 levels. 96,000, and that's in America, not even the world. In America, 96,000 deaths per year. Yeah, a lot of those are cardio problems, cardioprotective problems. But it's huge. Now, all these studies here, you guys can see by one of the things you got to check out right away is go to our new mybrainspan.com. This is a website we've designed for your patients. You can direct your patients to this. This puts it down at their level, very easy to understand. It puts a quick explainer video in the front page, but the great thing is it has all these different topics, different conditions or symptoms, from attention deficit to memory to weight loss and aging, performance and sports, all the way to chronic pain, to concussion, to pregnancy and fetal protection, fetal brain development, to dementia. They can click on each of these and it will give a synopsis of the studies that show how much protection you can have against these things by using this brain span assessment and understanding all of these numbers. Again, your inflammation index, your neuroprotective index, which is your omega-3 index, your neurotoxicity index, which is your palmitic acid and your trans fat. So those are very, very important to look at. So take a look at this new, again, mybrainspan.com. You can look at each of these. It has all the research and studies cited right there, all referenced. And again, look at the homepage. It kind of gives a quick 1, 2, 3 test, know how to change it, and then retest, and how important that is.
And Brian, that's a great. I just want to say that's a great site for people to reference. And I just think, when you look at treatment or even resilience to this injury, which we said is extremely prevalent, many millions every year in this country, and you go to a site like the CDC, our government's entity that's supposed to, provide all this education, and you go there and it talks about management of TBI, it's all just about diagnosing TBI. Right. So there's really little out there, and so it's important to where there's great science like we presented tonight, and there's great efficacy. We want to highlight that. Absolutely.
So kind of wrapping this up a little quick, we've already did a full webinar just on the cognitive assessment, but I just want to say that you can use all this stuff of understanding the health of the neurons and the cells is all great. But you do want to do these baseline of functional tests too. And that's what's great. We use the Brain Resource Database. It's the most validated database there is. It's the highest sensitivity between test, retest. It's a great way to establish a baseline and on each of these people. And then you can actually see after a concussion when they've returned to normal cognitive function, because you'll get the comparative scores on this. So again, this is not set up to necessarily use as solely as a return to play, but again, it is a very highly sensitive tool that can help you in those decisions or that is helping a lot of team doctors use that as well. Again, not specifically designed as a return to play. This is more as a resilient side, but it does work to assess that the cognitive function has returned to normal. Again, this is the same test used by Aetna, by Mercer, by Cerner, Nationwide, Kaiser, Humana, all are using this test. And you can see these tests retest reliability coefficient, especially on the continuous performance test, the total errors, switching of attention, 0.98, digit span, 0.89. These are very, very highly valid tests. And the convergence validity, again, these have been compared to gold standard paper pencil, and it's got the highest validity, convergent validity, probably of any online test there is. A lot of people would argue it's definitely more sensitive than the pen and paper test, but that's been established as the gold standard, so we always want to compare it to that. Dan, you want to talk about now, a lot of these people that you see are not going to have all this resilience. They're not going to be on high the omega-3s ahead of time, and then they get an injury. And I think Dan has some great information here on how to address that, and some of the case studies that are out there.
Yeah, and I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, so we'll have this protocol available, written out for people to, with a little bit deeper explanation of it than we have here for people to review. Now, let me just say that there is some great protocols developed that we're leveraging here from various scientists. The protocols, when it comes to severe TBI, have been some just amazing case reports, and some of them are highlighted here. And these were individual cases where neurosurgeons and doctors that I personally know and are friends with, some of which I served with in the military, stepped in and said, hey, we believe high dose omega-3 would help. And in these cases where they stepped in, the family was open to it, had unbelievable turnarounds and clinical improvements. And it, there's whole stories on that I could get into, but they were using 30 grams of fish oil for, a week, which at the actual formulation they were using, it was about 19 grams of EPA DHA a day down the feeding tubes. The Army's doing a lot further research and look into this as well for TBI, but that's all, severe injury, head injury, but some very, very interesting case reports. But all that just says is it backs up even the mild TBI that most of us are going to see with our athletes. We want to put them on this protocol here is sort of a light protocol for sort of not this isn't a severe head injury. This is, maybe a mild to moderate TBI. But you want to get them started on a much higher dose of EPA DHA. And some of this is based on those case reports and then some animal models. And so, it's difficult to study this. There's some people doing it, but this is a pretty good shot at what we know based on some case reports and other situations would be very helpful. So 3 grams EPA DHA 3 times a day. So we're talking 9 grams of EPA DHA. So that's going to be, could be, 18 grams of fish oil or so, depending on your concentrate. So we're just measuring EPA DHA for a week, then lower that down into week 2, 3 grams 2 times a day for 7 days. There's a great nonprofit called the Brain Health Research Institute. And a gentleman there, retired Army Colonel Doctor named Mike Lewis, has some information on these protocols up on his site. It's a nonprofit. We don't, we're not promoting them, but they do a lot of great work in this area, and a lot of great information on their site. And Mike was involved with saving some of the lives that are shown here on this slide. So, anyways, it's a great protocol. It's better than nothing. And we have good scientific reasoning to believe that it's going to help speed recovery of the brain.
Perfect. So I'll just close my part, and then Dan can close out. But there is nothing more important to get through to your patients for any of them that have kids in high impact sports, whether it's collegiate sports, whether it's high school sports, whether it's even younger than that, the elementary side. There is nothing more important for them then to take this assessment and understand where their omega-3 index is, where their balance of omega-3, omega-6s are, and if there's any neurotoxicity indicators that can impair this. If they do those correctly, they will heal correctly after a concussion. They will have the highest chance possible to be resilient and have complete recovery. Without that, every concussion leads to a bigger and bigger firestorm. It's cumulative results. Small concussions at first, the next one will actually exacerbate that same area. It won't heal completely each time if you don't have the proper cell health. So talk to your patients, make sure that they have the proper cell health. If they're playing any type of sport at all, they should understand where their brain health is. And again, this is throughout the whole body. And then, you know, like Dan talked about with those neurons as people are aging, if you don't know where your cell health is as you're aging, you are going into aging blind. And you could be losing actual density in the brain and not even know. And it's preventable. It's all preventable. And that's why it's so important. So I will stop right there.
Yeah, I'm just going to launch a quick poll, but before I do that, and again, that maintenance dose, I would say if you have any of your patients who are just playing athletes, or excuse me, that are playing sports who are athletes and they're not injured yet, they would be on the maintenance dose. But that's why you need to get them tested, because that maintenance dose for just regular resilience at 3 grams a day, maybe could be a little bit more. But that's why if we do the test and get them at that 8 or 9%, or even higher, maybe 10% if they're playing sports on their index, you know, it's better than just shooting it in the dark. But so again, use that assessment for your regular athletes to get them into the higher levels. And if it takes 3, if it takes 4, it takes 5, whatever it takes. But I would start at 3 grams per day of EPA DHA for all your athletes as a resilience tool. So why don't we take some questions out there? And Brian, I think you might have control of the Q&A, or they can send them in on chat as well.
I'm not sure if I have that. You know, we're with the internet right now as it is, Dan. I would probably, and it's probably top of the hour, why don't we just respond to any questions that we get by email?
Yeah, it is, Todd. You have a good point. Okay, so yeah, any questions, shoot us a note. And we'll be sure info@brainspan.com will get us both, and we'll be sure to we'll put a lot of the materials that we talked about tonight on the portal for our providers, or if you don't have access to that, let us know. We'll shoot it out to you. I'm going to go ahead and launch a quick poll. We want to know, excuse me, whoops, that's not the one I want. Poll. Start poll 2. And just one question tonight, because we're out of time. Just want to know how you found the webinar, and if you need help or interested in bringing this into your practice, we want to know that too. So if you just take a minute, answer that question, and then we'll wrap up. And if you want a recording of this as well, let us know. We record all these, and you can watch it later. Or if you want a copy of the slides, let us know that as well. Hey, Brian, is the poll pulling up on your side? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's there.
So you just click on one of those answers, and if you have to go, I know we're just past the hour. That's fine too, but I'd like to give everyone a chance to answer the question.
And for all the providers, this will be in your webinar tab in your portal. So you'll be able to access it there. When you become a provider for the BrainSpan assessment, what we do is we give you your own portal for the ones that are not providers right now. And you can access all of your patient reports in that. You can order more kits through that, but there's a whole webinars tab on there that has all this information. So every week's webinar is there, so you can go back to it and review it. All right, does that wrap it up, Dan?
Yeah, are you seeing the poll progress on your side?
No.
I'm just waiting to see. I think there's a couple people still voting. So
Okay.
it was interesting, you know, Brian, when you were showing some of those EEG patterns, it kind of tied back to our sleep webinar that we did. And when you saw that highly stressed, that high beta, and you saw how far that is from the some of the brainwave states as far as going into sleep, you could clearly see why physiologically a stressed out brain has such trouble going to sleep.
Absolutely, and you can see why a good amount of sleep problems could occur due to some type of post concussion injury.
Yeah.
It's all
Well, that's
connected.
probably why in the Army, you know, we've got a lot of the TBI soldiers end up having psychiatric like PTSD.
Right.
So there's a big linkage there between TBI and PTSD, probably just for that reason you mentioned.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hmm. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, Brian, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Perfect.